The valley remembered things people forgot. That was what Marin Holloway's grandfather used to tell her when they stood together on the porch before sunrise, watching mist crawl out of the low places along the Cottonwood River in Montana. The land keeps records, he would say. You just have to learn how to read them. Marin was 14 years old, and she had been reading those records for most of her life. She wasn't a geologist. She wasn't an engineer. She didn't have expensive equipment or a university degree. What she had was a green spiral notebook, decades of observations from her grandfather, and a habit of paying attention to things other people overlooked. The Holloway farm sat on 300 acres along the eastern bend of the Cottonwood River. The farmhouse had been built in 1911. The barn leaned slightly to the south, and Marin's father used to joke that it had been leaning that way since before he was born. But Marin knew that some things on the farm weren't funny. Some parts of the land moved. Some held water. Some didn't. And one particular stretch of bottomland had always behaved differently. Her grandfather had noticed it first. Or at least, he was the first person Marin knew who had written it down. He started keeping notebooks in 1971. For more than 5 decades, he recorded river levels, rainfall, animal behavior, flooding, soil conditions, and changes in vegetation. Marin had read nearly all of them. Then came the spring of 2026. The first thing she noticed was the Cottonwood River. It was running several inches lower than it normally did. Not enough for most people to care. But Marin cared. The killdeer were nesting farther from the riverbank. The cattails in the southern slough had thinned. And a wet patch at the bottom of the pasture, the same patch that had remained damp every May for as long as Marin could remember, looked completely dry. Almost completely. She took a stick and pushed it into the ground. The first 6 inches were hard and dry. Then the stick suddenly dropped. Marin pulled it back out. Dark mud clung to the end. She stared at it. Then she went inside and wrote everything down. A few days later, the trucks arrived. 3 white pickups came first. Then a yellow surveying rig. Then a black SUV that looked completely out of place on the gravel road. They stopped at the fence separating the Holloway farm from the old Pruitt property. The Pruitt family had sold the land the previous fall. 5,000 acres. Continental Trust Bank had purchased the entire parcel through its commercial real estate division. And they had big plans for it. A logistics and agricultural processing complex. A massive development expected to cost around $17 million. The main facility would sit on the lower portion of the property, close to the railroad spur. When Marin saw the plans, she immediately knew where they intended to build. She also knew something was wrong. She pointed toward the bottomland. You're putting the main building there. Her father looked at her. Marin. I wouldn't build there. Her father sighed. It's not our land. I know. Then leave it alone. Marin looked toward the survey crews. They don't know what's underneath it. Her father didn't answer. But Marin went inside and opened her notebook. A few days later, she finally approached the bank's project team. A woman named Lauren Castile was standing near the fence with several engineers. Lauren smiled. You must be the Holloway girl. Marin nodded. She looked at the plans. Then at the bottomland. The river used to run through there. Lauren glanced at the map. According to the survey, it hasn't been there for a very long time. My grandfather said it moved. One of the engineers looked up. We've got a geotechnical survey scheduled. Marin shook her head. The survey won't find it. The engineer smiled politely. Why not? Because the channel curves. We're using a professional grid survey. Marin looked across the property. My grandfather called it a lazy S. The engineer smiled. Well, we'll see what the survey says. Marin nodded. She had said what she needed to say. That night, she opened one of her grandfather's notebooks. She found an entry dated May 14, 1987. Bottom field flooded again. Third time in 11 years. Old channel running. Marin stared at the sentence. Then she opened her own notebook. She wrote, "They are going to build on it." The drilling rig arrived the following week. The engineers established a grid across the property. They drilled. They collected soil samples. They measured groundwater. And everything appeared normal. At least, according to their grid. The problem was that the buried channel wasn't straight. It curved beneath the land like a long, lazy S. The engineers drilled 12 feet down at each test point. They found firm ground. What they didn't know was that their drilling locations were passing on either side of the deepest portion of the buried channel. They were missing it laterally. Marin watched from the fence. She knew exactly what they were missing. But she didn't say anything. She had already warned them. Construction began in June 2026. Graders stripped the topsoil. Excavators dug the foundation. And in late June, workers encountered groundwater at the riverside portion of the excavation. A dark seep appeared in the wall of the foundation cut. The engineers inspected it. They considered it manageable. They installed drainage and continued. By August, concrete was being poured. And then Marin saw something that made her stop walking. A crack. It was thin. Almost invisible. It ran across the northeast corner of the foundation. The construction crew considered it minor. Marin didn't. She had seen that direction before. She opened her notebook. August 28, 2026. First crack. Northeast corner. Direction consistent with buried channel. She closed the notebook. And waited. By October, there were more cracks. The original crack had widened. 2 more had appeared. The building was still standing, but something underneath it was moving. Engineers returned to inspect the structure. One blamed the concrete. Another blamed curing conditions. Someone suggested drainage. But nobody was talking about the ground beneath the foundation. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. Because while the engineers were trying to figure out why their multimillion-dollar building was cracking, Marin noticed something happening on her family's side of the fence. The Holloway spring was changing. That spring had supplied clean water to the family for generations. But in November, the cattle suddenly stopped drinking from the southern trough. Marin noticed first. Her father tasted the water. He immediately spat it out. There was a faint metallic taste. Something was wrong. They called the county extension office. A sample was taken. 2 weeks later, the results came back. The water showed elevated turbidity, suspended sediment, and trace petroleum compounds consistent with disturbance upstream. The Holloway spring had been contaminated. Now the bank had 2 problems. A cracking building. And polluted groundwater moving toward a neighboring family farm. If you're enjoying stories like this, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We share stories about ordinary people who notice extraordinary things, overlooked warnings that eventually matter, and moments when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And now, let's get back to what happened in Montana. In early December, a meeting was called at the county extension office. Marin sat beside her father. Her green notebook was on her lap. Across the table sat Lauren Castile, Continental Trust executives, engineers, county officials, an environmental representative, and a young engineer named Ms. Aguilar. Aguilar had been uneasy about the original survey. So she started investigating on her own. She didn't just look at the bank's grid. She went backward. She studied historical aerial photographs dating back to 1954. She examined old soil surveys. She studied drainage patterns. She traced the direction of the Holloway spring. And eventually, she found something. A buried paleo channel. An ancient river pathway hidden beneath the modern valley. It curved diagonally beneath the construction site. Almost exactly where Marin had said it was. Aguilar rolled out a large map. A red line crossed the paper. The buried channel. Marin leaned forward. Her eyes followed the line. It was the same lazy as her grandfather had described. The same path he had recorded. The same path Marin had warned them about in April. Aguilar explained what the original survey had missed. The buried channel contained loose, permeable material extending far deeper than the engineers had expected. The 12-foot test pits had landed on the shoulders of the channel. They had found firm ground because they had never actually drilled through the deepest section. The foundation had been placed directly across the unstable portion. That explained the cracks, but it also explained the contaminated spring. Construction runoff had entered the buried channel. The water moved through the underground gravel and traveled toward the Holloway property. The land had been carrying the evidence underground the entire time. Then someone asked the question that changed the room. Did anyone know about this before construction began? Silence. Everyone looked at everyone else. Then Marin's father spoke. My daughter told you in April. Nobody answered. Marin didn't smile. She didn't say, I told you so. She simply looked down at the green notebook in her lap. Because she knew this wasn't about being right anymore. It was about what happened next. Construction was halted. Continental Trust was ordered to commission a full hydrogeological investigation. The original foundation would have to be removed. The spring would have to be remediated. And the bank was facing millions of dollars in additional costs on top of the $17 million it had already committed. But the biggest change came in January. The bank held another meeting. This time, Marin wasn't standing outside a fence. She was sitting at the table. A senior Continental Trust representative had flown in from Denver. He brought new plans. He looked at Marin. Then he said something completely different from what she'd heard months earlier. What else do you know about the land? Marin opened her notebook. For more than an hour, she talked. She explained where frost lingered. Where water disappeared. Where the ground became unstable. Where cattle avoided certain areas. Where the drainage changed. Where her grandfather had seen flooding. The engineers listened. They asked questions. They wrote things down. Then Marin pointed to a proposed retention pond. That won't hold water in August. One of the engineers looked at the plan. Why? Because the ground drains underneath it. They checked the data. She was right. The plan was changed. For the first time, the professionals weren't telling Marin what the land was doing. They were asking her what she had seen. The new facility was moved approximately 300 yards east, onto higher, firmer ground. The unstable bottomland was left alone. And eventually, Continental Trust placed the area under a conservation easement. The land that had nearly destroyed their original project would never be developed the same way again. But the bank wasn't finished. They wanted to recognize Marin's contribution. So they established a $10,000 educational scholarship in Marin Holloway's name, to support her future studies in geology, environmental science, engineering, or another field related to land and water. Her family was also compensated for the damage and loss of use of their spring. Marin was grateful. But the thing that meant the most to her came later. Months after construction had been relocated, a thick envelope arrived at the Holloway farmhouse. Inside was a professionally prepared copy of the final geological investigation. There was a map. The buried channel was marked in red. And beside it was an official name. The Holloway Paleo Channel. Marin read it twice. Then she carried the document outside. Her father was standing on the porch. The same porch where Marin's grandfather had once taught her that the land kept records. She handed him the paper. He read it slowly. Then he looked at his daughter. Your grandfather would have liked that. Marin smiled. By the following spring, the construction equipment was gone from the bottomland. The grass had begun to recover. The killdeer returned to their old nesting places, and the Holloway springs slowly began to clear. The valley looked ordinary again. But Marin knew better. The land had never been ordinary. It had been speaking the entire time. The river had left a record. Her grandfather had preserved it. Marin had noticed it. And eventually, even a $17 million project had been forced to listen. Somewhere in a Continental Trust office in Denver, a map now showed the hidden channel beneath that Montana valley. And in one corner was the name of the 14-year-old girl who had warned them before the first foundation was poured. Marin Holloway. She hadn't had a degree. She hadn't had expensive equipment. She hadn't had a team of engineers. She had a notebook. She had decades of observations. And she had learned to pay attention. Sometimes the most important warning doesn't come from the person with the biggest title. Sometimes it comes from the person who has been standing quietly in the same place long enough to notice what everyone else missed. Because the land keeps records. You just have to learn how to read them.